Prime Minister Narendra Modi is not a new face in Washington, D.C. He's been here before, but this time the stakes are higher. There is a war in Europe, there is a Cold War in Asia, and for both, the US needs Indian support. So Joe Biden is looking ahead. He wants to write a new chapter in India-US relations. Will India play along? Let me take you back 7 years. It was another June in Washington, D.C. Prime Minister Modi was addressing the US Congress. Something he said then stood out. Listen to this.
Today, our relationship has overcome the hesitations of history.
Today, our relationship has overcome the hesitations of history, he said. It was a very important statement. India and the US were effectively on the opposing sides during the Cold War. That hangover continued even after 1991. Thus, the hesitation. But in 2016, India declared that those hesitations are over. So this visit is about the next step, about trust and commitment, which is why the Prime Minister is traveling all the way to Washington, which is why Biden has pulled out his biggest red carpet to take this relationship to the next stage. Ask any strategic expert, and this is what they'll tell you. India and the US are natural partners, two vibrant democracies, two diverse societies, and two ambitious polities. Yes, differences exist, but it remains one of the most consequential relationships of our times. Which brings us to the visit. Let's start with Prime Minister Modi's schedule. His first stop is not Washington, it's New York. On the 21st of June, he will be at the United Nations headquarters. It's International Yoga Day, so the Prime Minister will lead the celebrations. And the next day is crucial, the business day as we call it. First, there will be a ceremonial welcome at the White House right behind me, followed by the big bilateral talks. After meeting Biden, the Prime Minister will head to the US Congress. He will address American lawmakers for the second time. The first was in 2016. In the evening, he will return to the White House. President Biden and the First Lady will be hosting a state dinner. It's an event made for the cameras. On the 23rd of June, there is more business. The Prime Minister will have lunch with Vice President Kamala Harris and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He will also meet top corporate leaders and the Indian diaspora. So that is the schedule. But what is expected from these engagements? We can divide those in three broad parts. First is symbolism. A state visit and a dinner is a very big deal here. It's reserved for special guests. Biden has hosted just 2 state dinners so far as president. One for French President Macron and the second for the South Korean president. You know how you save your best perfume for the best occasion? This is the diplomatic equivalent. The second part is the agenda. Talks are expected to cover a lot of issues like defense, energy, trade, China, and the Indo-Pacific. The Ukraine war, of course, will also be discussed. It is no secret that Biden would love India to toughen its position. Also, the G20. India will be hosting the Leaders Summit in September this year, the G20 Leaders Summit. America's support will be key to getting a joint statement out. Remember, Russia and China will also be there. They're also members of the G20. So consensus will be tough. Both sides will also be looking for more political impetus. You see, there's a limit to what bureaucrats can achieve, or even diplomats. In the end, you need the leadership. You need the Prime Minister and the President to ease things out, to solve the big knots. Biden and Modi will look to do that, to inject more momentum into this relationship. Which brings us to the third part, the deliverables. Defense seems to be the top priority at this point. At least 2 deals are expected either to be announced or to be signed. One is, of course, to manufacture jet engines in India. We've been talking about that on the show. The second is for India to buy Predator drones from the US. Around 30 drones for $3 billion. And both these deals are significant. The US has historically refused to transfer critical technology to India, and jet engine is one such critical technology. Reports say General Electric will sign a deal with Hindustan Aeronauticals Limited, HAL. We don't know the shape or the form of that deal, but Biden and Modi cannot stop at these. They should push on. Expanding defense manufacturing is good for both sides. The US can diversify its supply chains, and India, of course, gets more investments and jobs, not to mention a new source of weapons other than Russia. Like I said, the hesitancy is over. It's all about building trust and commitment. And defense is a good indicator of that. In 2008, India barely had any defense trade with the Americans. Now it's more than $20 billion. The overall trade, $190 billion, which makes the United States of America India's largest trading partner. So there's a lot in common, a lot going for both sides. There's a lot of potential. But, as always, there are challenges as well. One thing is clear though, Joe Biden is betting big on this visit. Like all relationships, there is something in it for both sides. But one party seems to be more eager, and that is the American side. That's US President Joe Biden. Do you remember his campaign promise in 2020? He said America is back. From the looks of it, it's back to square one. Biden's foreign policy record does not look good as of today. He failed to revive the Iran nuclear deal. He failed to stop the Ukraine war. He's also losing allies in West Asia, which makes you wonder, where are the positives? Well, this visit could be one of them. If Biden can cement the India-US relationship, his legacy would be set. Because New Delhi is a big prize, the biggest democracy in the world. A major Indian Ocean power, which is also a nuclear-armed power. A leader of the global south. A historic partner of the Russians. You can't ignore India anymore. It's the 5th largest economy in the world. It offers you supply chain diversity and skilled labor. Joe Biden wants all of that. He knows that India is key to America's eventual showdown with China, whether it's taking away the factories or producing semiconductors or patrolling the Indo-Pacific. So what does the US president do? He lays out the big red carpet. If Biden can get India on board, he can sell it to his voters. He's facing re-election next year. And from the looks of it, he will take on Donald Trump. So it will be a repeat of the 2020 election. Although a lot has changed since then, President Biden has presided over a period of rising cost of living. He's also lost the US House of Representatives. His approval rating is around 40%, which is the lowest of his presidency. And Trump, on the other hand, is in legal trouble. He has been charged in 2 separate cases. So my point is, anything can happen. It's going to be a big contest. Biden may or may not be in the White House next year, so he's pulling out all the stops. There are 2 aspects to this strategy. Number one, the Indian-American pull. It's a huge community in the US, numbering more than 4 million. They're the 2nd largest immigrant voting bloc. And most of them support Prime Minister Modi. You quote the Prime Minister, you get their vote. At least that's the assumption. Donald Trump tried the same. In 2016, he released this campaign video.
Abhi ki bar, Trump Sarkar.
That was Prime Minister Modi's 2014 election slogan. Trump copied it, and it seems to have helped. Perhaps Biden is expecting similar results this time. The second aspect is strategic. I already mentioned what India brings to the table for the Americans. Yes, the defense deals and the tech transfer is great, but for Joe Biden, that is not the end goal. The end goal for him is political, to recruit India into the American camp. And that would really help him domestically too. Just think back to another American president, Richard Nixon, known for just 2 things. One is the Watergate scandal and his disgraceful exit from the White House. The second is his China policy. Richard Nixon began relations with the communist regime in China. He opened a second front against the Soviet Union. It played a crucial role in the Cold War, perhaps even contributed to the end of the Cold War. Joe Biden is trying to do something similar as president, to use India's popularity and strategic importance to benefit domestically. The question is, will Prime Minister Modi play that game? We ask because it's a dangerous one, especially because it's targeted at one country, China. Speaking of which, Beijing is hosting a very important visitor as we speak, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. It was a long overdue trip. The last US Secretary to visit China was Mike Pompeo. That was in 2018, so it's been 5 years. Blinken was supposed to visit in February, but that trip was postponed by the balloon saga. You may remember that story. We reported it. Chinese spy balloons were spotted over American skies. Washington shot down one of them and postponed the trip. Anyway, it's finally happening. Blinken had 3 important meetings in Beijing, with President Xi Jinping, with Foreign Minister Qin Gang, and with top diplomat Wang Yi. How did the meetings go? Well, here's what President Xi Jinping said after meeting Antony Blinken.
The 2 sides have also made progress and reached agreement on some specific issues. This is very good.
So some progress and some agreement. I guess that was expected. You see, China-US ties have hit rock bottom. So the expectations from this visit were pretty low. Blinken's mission was to keep the lines of communication open to avoid any miscalculations. But for China, the big issue was Taiwan. President Xi told Antony Blinken that relationships should be based on mutual respect and sincerity, a bit rich coming from the expansionist in chief. Either way, the visit seems to have gone by without much fuss, way better than the shouting contest in Alaska 2 years back. But let's come back to Washington. China will be a key issue when Biden and Modi talk. The US may not say it out loud, but they're locked in a Cold War with Beijing. The White House has a two-part strategy. One is economic warfare, all the sanctions, the tariffs, the export controls. The idea is to weaken the Chinese economically, to take factories and jobs out of China. The second strategy is military deterrence. We've seen more US activity in the Indo-Pacific. Biden has also deployed more warships and submarines in the region, so the message is quite clear. The Indo-Pacific will not be a Chinese lake. Where does India figure in that plan? New Delhi is key to both these strategies, economic and military. Again, I come back to the question, will Prime Minister Modi agree to what Biden has in mind? Well, unlike the US, India shares a border with China, a long, contested and volatile border. The two armies faced off in the year 2020 in Galwan, and since then there's been a standoff. 38 months and no sign of de-escalation. We've been locked in a standoff with the Chinese for 38 months. Thousands of soldiers have been deployed on either side. Even a small miscalculation can be deadly. And Prime Minister Modi cannot ignore this border issue. He cannot push China beyond a point. The US, on the other hand, faces no such restrictions. They're sitting safe, thousands of miles away. We've seen this contrasting approach in the Quad as well. India has been reluctant to give the Quad a military color. Yes, there are joint exercises, but at its heart, the Quad is non-military. And don't get me wrong, India very much sees China as a growing threat. The only difference is in the approach. Will Joe Biden understand that? As things stand today, he may not really have a choice. At this stage, Biden cannot afford to antagonize India. So his only option is to play along. Having said that, he will be expecting something positive. In fact, let me walk you through some recent events. South Korea's president visited Washington in the month of April. And then last week, a US nuclear submarine docked in Korea. The Filipino president was also here in the US. He then granted the Americans access to multiple military bases. Last month, Antony Blinken traveled to Papua New Guinea. Biden was supposed to go, but he pulled out at the last moment, so Blinken went. Either way, the Americans got something out of Papua New Guinea. Unimpeded access to bases in Papua New Guinea. Now, do you see the trend here? The US has been busy in the Indo-Pacific. They've gotten what they wanted from these countries, from South Korea, from the Philippines, from Papua New Guinea. So will India be next? Well, Biden is certainly dangling the carrot. We mentioned the jet engines and the drones. That's part of a large US project to pump money and to pump technology into India. But what does America want in return? Probably a second front in the conflict against China. It's purely a self-serving policy. And how should India respond? Well, with some self-service of its own. Challenging China militarily does not make sense at this point. Neither does joining the US camp. Prime Minister Modi has repeatedly emphasized on strategic autonomy, on a multipolar world. He wants to challenge China, but on his own terms. So it's up to Biden to dehyphenate things, to see India as a partner, not a pawn. One of India's strengths, as we mentioned, is its diaspora. Indian Americans make up more than 1% of the US population. That's over 4 million people. Seems like a small number, but its influence should not be underestimated because this is a very important segment of the American society. Socially, economically, and increasingly politically. And the White House knows this. As Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi lands in Washington, D.C., Indians in America will be keenly watching and participating in the events. What does this visit mean for them? What are their expectations? We spoke to some members of the Indian community in Washington, D.C. to bring you this ground report. When Prime Minister Modi met President Biden last month, the American leader had a complaint. He said Modi was too popular. Biden told Modi he was making preparations for a grand reception in Washington and he'd run out of tickets a month before the event because the Indian leader was too popular. That popularity was on display again. On Sunday, unity marches were held in 20 American cities. Members of the Indian diaspora showed up in large numbers. It was their way to welcome the Indian Prime Minister. We're at the Washington Memorial, where the Indian-American community has gathered to conduct a unity march to welcome Prime Minister Modi. Such marches are being held in at least 20 cities across the United States. And this is the community's way of welcoming the Indian Prime Minister. This is a 4 million strong community we're talking about. They form about 1% of the US population, and as a congressman recently pointed out, they pay 6% of the taxes in America. This is a very constructive community that the Prime Minister has engaged with. He's known for his engagements with the diaspora across the world, and in a way he started this tradition here in the United States with his event, the mega event that he held in 2014 at New York's Madison Square Gardens. That was in 2014, when Modi visited the US for the first time as Prime Minister. 19,000 people turned up to see him. The crowd waved and chanted his name. The Prime Minister's face was beamed on a giant screen, even painted on canvas live. In the years since, the engagement with the diaspora has continued, and the support base seems to have grown.
भव्य होने, विशाल होने, ये टेक्सास के स्वभाव में है.
In 2019, Modi addressed an even bigger rally in Houston. It was called the Howdy Modi event. 50,000 people attended, including then US President Donald Trump. This week will be his 8th visit as Prime Minister. He'll address the US Congress for the second time, the only Indian Prime Minister to be invited for a joint sitting twice. For the diaspora, it's a matter of pride.
Modi Saab and Biden together, we hope that the friendship lasts a very long time and we bring peace to the world solutions, and the two great leaders meeting is a very, very good thing.
Our Indian diaspora already benefited. Our students especially, a long waiting green card, we got some relief in green card.
But with a large fan base comes the weight of expectations too. The Indian diaspora is keenly watching this trip. Their expectations have grown with their support. They look to the Prime Minister to address their concerns, to promote Indian interests in America, and to strengthen their bond with India.
So heartening to see so much enthusiasm and just energy. You feel it around. And
I'd say fantastic enthusiasm, and it's a great participation from a different part of India. And it was great to see how people are so galvanizing. There is a march for a peace, and hope all this partnership, India and US partnership, can bring up a great solution for a globally peace.
The US says this visit is a transformative one. Washington wants a deeper relationship with New Delhi, and a key factor in that will be these people. Their support can propel the India-US relationship. Let's come back to the visit. Here in Washington, D.C., you feel like the US is romancing Narendra Modi. A state visit, a lavish dinner, a throng of people, all of it makes for a great event and headlines. But that is only the highlight reel. There's a long backstory too, and like all love stories, this too had its twists and turns. Let me start with a picture. This is from the year 1994, where a much younger Narendra Modi stands outside the White House. He'd been invited by the American Council of Young Political Leaders. It's a non-profit organization. Clad in a simple cotton kurta, he stands along with some other political leaders, probably oblivious of how his America story will unfold. About a decade later, that story takes an unexpected turn. Modi's visa is revoked in the year 2005. He's banned from entering the United States of America. Why? Over the Gujarat riots of 2002, where he was acquitted by Indian courts but held guilty by the Americans. Like all things, this too passed. Within the next decade, things began to change and change dramatically for Narendra Modi. His political star rose, as did his profile on the world stage. You could say Modi's rags to riches story mirrors the phenomenal rise of India. It is now the world's fastest growing major economy, a digital powerhouse, the most populous nation, and the largest democracy. The Modi story took a turn in the year 2014. He led his party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, to a landslide victory in the general election. He became the Prime Minister of India. And within a few months, this is what happened. Prime Minister Narendra Modi made his first triumphant visit to the United States. He had a private dinner with President Obama. He toured the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial with the President. He received a rally fit for a rock star at Madison Square Garden with 19,000 cheering members of the Indian diaspora. This marks the beginning of America's budding romance with Modi, which grew with each visit over the years. But this week's visit, his eighth, could be historic and path-breaking because this is his first state visit to the US. He's only the third Indian leader to do so, to come on a state visit to America. During his tenure of 9 years, this is the 12th time Modi will address the legislature in a foreign country. This is the highest number of times for any Indian Prime Minister till date, much higher than what his predecessors achieved during their respective tenures. Dr. Manmohan Singh addressed foreign legislatures 7 times in his 10-year tenure. Indira Gandhi 4 times, Nehru thrice, Rajiv Gandhi and Atal Bihari Vajpayee twice, and former prime ministers like Morarji Desai and Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao only once. And specifically talking about addressing the US legislature, former prime ministers have done so too, including Nehru, Rajiv Gandhi, P.V. Narasimha Rao, Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh. But Prime Minister Modi will become the only Indian PM to address the US Congress for the second time. And this is testimony not only of Narendra Modi's rising influence, but also of India's growing stature on the world stage. Modi has single-handedly changed the political landscape of India. There is unwavering determination towards progress, with development as a key driver. So it's no surprise that America is going all out to partner with India. And only a decade ago, few anticipated that Modi would become such an ardent champion of stronger ties with the United States, that he would go on from being persona non grata to Prime Minister and America's state guest. The United States became a democracy in the 1700s, one of the world's oldest democracies. India joined the club almost 200 years later. But India made long strides. Today, it is the world's largest democracy and a thriving, robust force. New Delhi and Washington are more than 12,000 kilometers apart, but they have more in common than you would imagine. Today, we'll explore that. From the National Mall in Washington, D.C. and the Central Vista in New Delhi, how 2 vibrant seats of democracy are linked by a single thread: the ability to evolve and represent their nation. Our next report brings you the tale of the 2 capitals. Behind me is the US Capitol building. It is part of what is called the front yard of America, the National Mall, home to the most iconic buildings in the country, also the seat of the US Congress. The entire expanse is a reflection of a confident country. But how was it born? I have a story to tell you. A tale of 2 capitals, Washington, D.C. and New Delhi. One symbolizes the world's oldest democracy, the other is home to the world's largest democracy. Both capitals are separated by distance, but united by shared values and some history. Our story begins in Washington, D.C. The year was 1775, the US Revolution had just ended, and the Americans wanted to create a new identity for themselves, something that breaks away from their past of the British colonial rule. George Washington was the president, and he had a plan. He picked the land himself. He passed something called the Resident Act that helped create the US Capitol and the President's House, which is the seat of the US government. And for this, he handpicked a civil engineer. It was this man, Pierre Charles L'Enfant. He designed the first plans for the city of Washington, D.C., inspired by the Champs-Élysées in Paris. He He visualized Washington from scratch, a grand city with wide avenues, public squares, and buildings that inspire, within a district of hills, forests, and greenery. What L'Enfant did not know then was this: his vision would inspire another democracy over 200 years later. India, yet another democracy emerging from the shadow of its colonial past. A few years back, India launched a major project, the Central Vista Project, an attempt to decolonize India's capital. When Edward Lutyens and Herbert Baker built New Delhi, they too were inspired by L'Enfant's designs. But the old Central Vista was made to serve the British. The India of the 21st century needed an upgrade. The new Central Vista aims to represent a new India with a brand new parliament building and a central secretariat to house all ministries. Also a revamped boulevard, now called the Kartavya Path, or the Path of Duty. This is India's new Central Vista, and its similarities with the National Mall in Washington are striking. Both are iconic spaces, featuring grand and expansive buildings, imbued with deep symbolism. Each monument on the National Mall represents a part of America's history. In New Delhi, the India Gate and the National War Memorial evoke a sense of national pride. And the new parliament represents the rich tradition of democracy in India. This was a radical change for India, much debated, as most decisions are in a robust democracy. But such changes are part of the story for Washington's National Mall. It has undergone many such transformations. It has been rebuilt, burned, extended, and restored many times. The architectural revamp did not alter the core of America's democratic foundations. India's Central Vista project is no different. It's an attempt to revamp the democratic spaces of a confident country, a country that sees itself as a lot more than a former British colony. And it is proof that democracies need to evolve. Whether it be the National Mall behind me or the Central Vista in New Delhi, they show that democracies need to be in tune with the times to truly reflect the countries they represent. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Indonesia and SpaceX have launched a telecommunications satellite. This project is worth over $500 million. It aims to provide internet access to remote corners of Indonesia. In the United States, a huge funnel cloud formed over a town in Oklahoma amid tornado warnings. We'll show you a time-lapse video. In Germany, a Spanish motorcycle racer crashed for the 5th time during a warm-up race. And finally, what makes the 19th of June significant? We're taking you back in history. In 1865, Texas, it's a state in America, on this day, a group of enslaved African Americans learned that they were free from slavery. Their president was Abraham Lincoln. Over 2 years back, he had signed a landmark law. It's called the Emancipation Proclamation. It was meant to free all the slaves. This day is also called Juneteenth. It's a federal holiday here in the US. We're leaving you with this. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow from Washington, D.C.
Vehicle is pitching downrange.